Hey, welcome back, modelers. So today I've got something kind of special, inspired by some of the musings that's been going on the internet through Facebook through past couple of days. So we're going to talk about judging. So two parts to this. We're going to talk about how IPMS does their judging right now. What are the rules of the game, so to speak. And then I'm going to give you a few things on how can we change this up? How can we do something a little different? And hopefully in the comments have a little bit of a discussion about, well, that won't work because this, or it could work if we did it this way, or whatnot, rather than just say point system is stupid, right? Or whatever happens that I've heard all around. So first of all, how does judging, and specifically aircraft, happen at nationals? What is the rules of the game? Now, with it, there is a hierarchy. They do look at all sorts of things with it. And the name of the game is objectivity. So all the rules are trying to be objective with things, right? So the first thing that they're going to look for is construction, okay? That becomes kind of the basic. Or you have to build it before you can paint it, before you can weather it, before you can all things like that. So first thing very much that they're going to look at is construction. And to be honest, from what I judged at nationals, it's really hard to come across a aircraft that has no construction problems whatsoever. That's perfect and flawless. So that's where they're going to look first. And with that, you're going to weed out and kind of go, okay, well, this has 4 construction problems. This one just has 1. It's going to be better. Or just try to look into maybe the top 4 or 5 if you've got a big category and try to corral in which ones have the least amount of construction problems and then gauge a little bit with that. And then beyond that, then that's where we're going to go look at the other hierarchy where we're going to get into the paint and the finish. And to be honest, a lot of the builds that I looked at, the regular paint itself, all quite good. So they would, get a check mark in my book as satisfactory or meets the criteria of what we're looking for, right? So we would look into there, and on top of finish, we might look at weathering and a few things with that. Added details, then the scope of the work, and all of that. So that's kind of the mentality of everything. If you want to follow along, there actually is on the IPMS website, if you go to, I'll put a link in the description where everything comes from, right? So with that, basic construction is first, and they go in through and look at everything that they're going to look with that. Then getting into details, painting, finishing, and onward, right? So that is currently what we're at. How do we go in and we actually look at basic construction? Well, probably it depends on which team and everything they go into, but for my judging team and the teams that I've been with, some stuff you can look at pretty easy. I've got a little bit of a sample here that I didn't build this, someone else's. That's has a few more problems that are going to be easier pronounced. So if we look into here, you can see big seam mark right there, right? So that's something we're going to look at. What we're going to do is we're also going to look at alignment. Here's a good way to look at alignment. So this is actually pretty good. I think it's a Tamiya kit. You can see the wheels are visible just right at the same time. And then the other check that we can do is we put this on the ground and measure clearance, right? So this wing should just be as far off the ground as far as this one, right? To make it level. Whether it's that way in real life, maybe this fuel tank is a little less versus other, it's hard to say. But it comes down to the basics of construction, right? If you're constructing it properly, then that's where the basics come down to. Okay, so we look at that with alignment. Big thing with all of them, and definitely with me. I learned a few things to look for and how to look for with judging the alignment and everything, and came back and looked at a few of my builds and went, oh my goodness, that part's perfect, but I goofed on there. It's just a little bit too forward, right? The wheels. So checking to see with that test, like I said, like this, to see if it's too far forward and back. And then you can do a few things with this to make sure that we've got alignment in all directions, right? With the wheels, that's one of the biggest things. Then all the other things that make the airplane fly and maneuver properly. So all these tailplanes, all those need to be equal. What I like to do with that is measure distance from here to here and here to here, and they should be the same, right? So that's where we get into basic construction. Last on there would be getting into the canopies, make sure there's no fogging, there's not a lot of gaps and everything. I mean, you can see all sorts of ridges and issues with this, where we can go into some critique of how that canopy lines up on there. We get into some glue marks and everything. I mean, there's a big step from here to here. So there's all sorts of things that we can look at with how all the pieces go together, including the canopy. Now, the next part that's a little bit weird on the handbook is it actually has, under basic construction, decals. Decals must look painted on, depicting painted markings. But it pops up again in painting and finishing. So I'm not sure what that all means, because I definitely think of the decals as, painting and finishing, especially with some of my builds where decals were kept to a minimum, right? So that's where we get into there. All the different details that we're adding to it, all the different effects, all the different additions, especially if you're getting out of the box category, getting into all the aftermarket barrels, photo etch, and all that. Make sure that they look good. And to be honest, with a lot of our judging that we were doing, we didn't even have to take much look into the cockpit, because we would be able to find enough criteria based on the rest of the aircraft. And some categories you're going to have just like this, where the canopy is closed, and it's a little tricky to see how well they did in there. So some details, it doesn't really sway the judging in that, right? But we get into there and all of that. Okay. Painting and finishing, right? Paint should be smooth. Shouldn't get into any silvering with the decals and all sorts of things. It should look painted on. And we get into weathering, which is a little bit of a tricky subject for all of this. Most of the time, it doesn't even come up, because we find enough to judge on with the construction portion, right? And we can figure out first, second, and third based off that. Or at least a definite first, and then a little bit of deliberation. And also, when it comes down to this, I want to also mention, none of this was just kind of, I like this more, or everything. We're trying to be objective, and we definitely take our time. With categories, my team averaged about an hour per category. I did 3 in my group, and then joined another group to help them out after. And it was about their 5 hours. So we definitely take our time. Don't think that we just dismiss something real fast or whichever, okay? So that's kind of, let's see if I missed anything in the handbook here. The likelihood that you're going to be dismissed because your RLM color is a little bit off shade, no, not likely. When it comes to a lot of these competitions, we go through the hierarchy: construction first, and if construction is perfect or equal, like this has one problem and this one has one problem, then we move on to the rest in the hierarchy and look at like the paint, the finish, the scope of work, because if we have more of a basic build and some of that. So that brings up a few questions, right? With the current scope of judging, is it incentivized to be simple? In a way, to be honest. It kind of depends. If you have a basic Tamiya build and it's flawless, you probably win, versus somebody that's building a Zukimura crazy, expensive, detailed masterpiece, and it has a few problems, right? So there is a little bit of that, right? The other thing is that always brings up a lot in the different groups is weathering. So, like, how do you judge weathering? Is it impossible to judge weathering too, right? I mean, is it just purely subjective what weathering is? So I thought about that. When we look at other groups, figure painting, there's no construction for the most part in a lot of those, right? So how do they do theirs? With dioramas, there's a lot of that. Tanks, of course, a big portion of it comes down to their weathering. So if they can do it, why can't aircraft integrate that into the mix? And how would we do that? Well, how do we break away from being the mentality of, well, you guys just only care about construction? Now, to be honest, I can dismiss some of that. It's more of we look at construction first, and if we see no problems, then we move on. And most of the time, we just see problems, and so it doesn't even get to things like that, right? But we do try to take everything in. At least when I'm judging, I try to look at everything in general. But a fancy weathering job is not going to save you from a wheel that's very much out of kilt, right? Or a wing that's drooping. It's not going to save you. Those points are just not going to be bonus in there, right? So how can we change this to make it more beneficial to having the risk takers in this? How do we be more beneficial to maybe the weathering people that like to do that? Because if you haven't noticed, a lot of the younger audience enjoys weathering, right? So for IPMS to succeed, we really need those younger audiences to be feeling like they should belong in there, right? And that brings up a whole other few other subjects with that, right? So this is what I would like to propose. What if we did something similar to amps? And this is where I've got a few of you that are probably going to shut off and go be like, oh my goodness, no point system. Oh my goodness, it's a horrible idea. Rather than just tune off, tell me why this would be a bad idea. Let's have a little bit of a talk on this. Let's see if we can fix this. Because the worst thing that I would ever want to see happen is just IPMS fade away into an oblivion. We don't want that. So with amps, we have a point structure with everything. We grade each of them. And by the way, when I say we, I've never been to an amps. I've just done a little bit of research over the past couple days looking on how they do things. And I've heard about. So a little bit of a snippet there. So what if we did that? So I created a little bit of a point system. And of course, how this all works is up for a debate. And we can get as nitpicky as we want with each of these point systems. And to say, like, give them 5 points if no errors. 1 to 2 errors with construction, give them this points and all that. So it is very much straightforward and all that, right? So what we'd have, I've got a little bit of an idea here. First, of course, construction is worth 5 points, 10 points overall for everything. And alignment would be 2, seams 2, glue and other kind of points with construction and all of that for 1 point. So if you're flawless, 5, and then deductions from there, right? But rather than just move on and just say, oh, we'll dismiss that or whatever, we move on to the other parts. So with finish, it's worth 4 points. And we have paint as 1 point, markings, decals, 1 point, weathering, 1 point, and then continuity with the finish, right? If we have some exhaust stains and craziness with the exhaust where it's been running for 100,000 flight hours or something, but then everything else looks pristine from the factory, that seems a little odd, right? So things with that. Then one other point we have for level of difficulty, right? We could even go in and look at more points on this too, to look at kind of how they have extra points for whether or not their research. So if they put research materials and say, this is the exact subject that I'm trying to model after, cool, maybe 0.5 on top or there, right? I'm not set on the actual point values. I'm just trying to think of a different structure that we can do, right? That's what we're trying to gain. So the benefits that I see with this is everybody has feedback. Everybody that enters in has that direct feedback. You don't have any events of the people trying to find a judge and go, why didn't I win or whatever, right? It's right into here. Now, if you want to, there might be a little bit of debate of going, well, why didn't I get full points on this and this, right? And there, you still need some pointing out, but it should alleviate a lot of maybe some of the frustrations I've had of just, well, I don't know what to look for. Well, what was wrong with it? I would need to know so I can not do that next time, right? So you alleviate some of that. It also opens it up to bigger evaluations, so we can look at some of the newer nuances of weathering and all this and have that as calculated as part of it. Would this change some of the results? Maybe, but to be honest, sometimes not. If you have perfect, flawless finishes, 4 points, but your construction is horrid, let's say, or maybe in the middle, 2.5 points, well, you're 6.5. If you have somebody that is 5 points perfect construction, but then they didn't really try to do anything weathering or whatever, or something where the finish just isn't right on there, they would still do better, right? And so in theory, it's similar, but I think it's a lot more calculated, right? It's where a lot of agencies, when you actually have a full critique of something, you go through the process of not just even when you're reviewing something on Amazon, you don't just put 5 stars and leave it at that. You say, well, 5 stars, but based on here, the speed of the computer I thought was great. Looks ugly, so I only give them 2 stars for that. Speed of shipping was great, give them there. But customer service, I'll only give you 1 star, right? And it all equals out, right? So that, I think, would work better. Now, for some of you guys that are in-amps, tell me, what are the problems you've seen? What are some disadvantages? Why is this something that we wouldn't want to move to, right? Of course, I'm not the IPMS president or anything, so it's not like I'm making the decision. This is more a thought experiment. If somebody else in the hierarchy listens to this and goes, cool, I like it, figure out the point system and come back to me with the grading criteria and we'll implement it. I don't know. But all I'm doing is just trying to make sure that there's an evolution to the society, right? So by all means, let me know what you think in the chat. If you think it's just a horrible idea, if you're like, no, keep it the way it is because I win every year and I want to keep winning, whatever it may be, I don't know. Or if you're like, please, nationals, there's a lot of just things that just didn't interest me. I want to liven things up or whatever your motivation is with all these. Let me know in the chat. Let's have this as be a bit of a discussion. But these are just my thoughts on the matter. So let me know in the chat. And we'll talk to you next time when we get into the Tamiya F4 Phantom. And I'll have an advanced copy of the Kinta Studio cockpit. So until next time.